There comes a moment in a man's later years when words cut deeper than actions. 78-year-old Henry learned this the hard way. After 52 years of marriage, he thought he understood his wife better than he understood himself. But over time, she began saying certain phrases, subtle at first, then sharper, heavier, and more painful. Words that drained his spirit instead of filling it. Words that made him feel invisible, unwanted, or guilty, simply for existing. One evening, after a quiet dinner, she looked at him and said something so piercing that he stopped mid-breath. Not because he was angry, but because he felt something inside him collapse. Later, alone in his recliner, he remembered a quote by Carl Jung he had read decades earlier. "You are what you do not, what you say you'll do." But he also remembered another lesser-known insight Jung shared with his students. A person reveals their soul through the way they speak to you. Those words haunted him. He began to wonder whether his wife's recent comments were not just emotions, but symptoms of something deeper and dangerous for his emotional health. And the truth is, Jung warned that certain types of speech from a spouse reveal psychological decay in the relationship, decay so severe that the partner receiving it must consider leaving for the sake of their dignity, sanity, and final years of peace. This is not about divorcing lightly or abandoning responsibility. It is about recognizing emotional violence, subtle or overt, that destroys a person from the inside out. And according to Jung, a man in his senior years must protect his psychological integrity above all, because emotional wounds after 60 do not heal the way they once did. Carl Jung believed that after midlife, a person enters what he called the individuation phase, a period where the soul seeks peace, authenticity, and emotional safety. In this phase, psychological injuries cut deeper because the elderly have less emotional resilience, less time to heal, and less tolerance for chaos. When a spouse repeatedly uses certain harmful phrases, Jung said, this reveals a shadow self, the unconscious part of a person capable of cruelty, manipulation, or emotional abandonment. These words are not simply expressions of frustration. They are projections of unresolved psychological wounds being thrown onto their partner. For younger couples, therapy, communication, and growth might repair the damage. But Jung believed that in old age, a man must make a different calculation. If the home becomes a battlefield, if the spouse becomes a source of emotional poison, and if words are used as weapons instead of bridges, the damage to the soul may be irreversible. Henry's doctor once told him stress is silent heart disease, but Jung would have added, emotional abuse is a slow spiritual death. That is why this conversation matters, especially for older men who grew up in a generation where expressing pain was considered weakness. Many endured toxic marriages in silence, believing loyalty meant suffering quietly. But loyalty should never require self-destruction. There are 5 phrases Jung said that reveal when a relationship is no longer a partnership, but a psychological danger zone. And if a wife speaks these words consistently without remorse, reflection, or willingness to repair the harm an elderly man may need to protect his remaining years by stepping away. In today's video, we will reveal the 5 specific things Carl Jung warned about the sentences that reveal deep emotional hostility, contempt, or psychological manipulation in a marriage. You will learn why these phrases are not simply rude or disrespectful, but deeply symbolic in Jungian psychology. You will also see how they impact a senior man's heart, mind, self-worth, and long-term health. And most importantly, you will hear real examples from seniors like Henry Men who struggled, doubted, and ultimately found clarity by understanding Jung's teachings. If you have ever felt belittled, dismissed, humiliated, or emotionally abandoned in your own home, this message may help you recognize what is truly happening beneath the surface. Before we continue, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Senior Ways, and comment below. Do you believe words can damage a relationship more than actions? Your voice could help another senior feel seen and heard. Phrase number 1, "You're useless to me now." The most dangerous expression of contempt. The first phrase Jung warned about is the most poisonous of them all. Henry remembered the exact moment his wife said it. He had just come in from the backyard after trying to fix a loose fence post. His knees hurt, his back ached, and he felt exhausted. When he told her he couldn't finish the job that day, she sighed heavily and said, "Well, you're useless to me now." She didn't yell, she didn't curse. Her tone was cold, flat, careless, but the words felt like a blade entering his chest. Carl Jung believed contempt is the deadliest toxin in any relationship. Not anger, not disagreement, contempt, because contempt destroys the soul of the person who receives it. At its core, contempt says, "You do not matter, you have no value, you exist only to serve me." Jung wrote that contempt emerges when the speaker has projected their own fear of aging weakness or failure onto their partner. When someone is scared of becoming irrelevant, they sometimes lash out at the person closest to them, hoping to escape the fear inside themselves. But for an elderly man, being told you're useless cuts into the deepest layers of identity. After 60, a man's sense of worth often shifts away from physical ability and into emotional presence, wisdom, and companionship. When a spouse attacks his value, she isn't criticizing a moment, she is denying his entire existence. Henry described the feeling perfectly. It wasn't just hurt, it was erasure. Jung warned that once contempt becomes a pattern, the relationship is spiritually dead. Contempt signals a collapse of respect, affection, and empathy. And without these, no marriage can nourish the soul of an aging man. If a wife says this phrase once in a heated moment and apologizes, that is human. But if she says it repeatedly, casually, or with no remorse, Jung advised that the man must distance himself emotionally or physically for his own survival. Because a man cannot thrive where he is treated as disposable, and in old age the heart cannot endure prolonged humiliation without consequences, emotional, psychological, or even physical. Phrase number 2, everything wrong in my life is your fault. The projection that destroys peace. The second phrase Jung identified is the hallmark of projection, blaming someone else for one's own unresolved inner conflicts. Henry heard this many times, especially when his wife felt overwhelmed or unhappy. If we had more money, it's because of you. If the kids don't visit, that's on you. If I'm unhappy, it's your fault. Carl Jung famously said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But in unhealthy relationships, instead of understanding themselves, people blame their partner. This phrase is especially toxic for elderly men because they often carry decades of responsibility on their shoulders. Many grew up believing that being a good husband meant solving every problem. So when their spouse blames them for everything, they absorb the guilt even when it isn't theirs. Psychologically, projection happens when someone refuses to face their own mistakes, regrets, or disappointments. Instead of asking, "What am I feeling?" or "Why am I unhappy?" they point at the nearest target, often the gentle, stable, aging partner who doesn't fight back. For seniors, this blame can feel crushing. Henry said he often lay awake at night wondering if he truly had ruined things, even though deep down he knew he hadn't. Jung warned that this kind of chronic blame erodes a man's sense of self. Over time, he begins to doubt his memories, his actions, his goodness. This is psychological manipulation, not always intentional, but deeply harmful, and the danger grows with age. A man in his 70s or 80s may already be battling physical pain, loneliness, or shrinking social circles. When his home becomes a place of blame, his body reacts with stress hormones that raise blood pressure, weaken the immune system, and increase the risk of heart attack or stroke. One psychologist described it as death by 1,000 accusations. The practical truth is this: if a wife repeatedly blames her husband for everything wrong in her life and she refuses to take responsibility or seek help, Jung advised that the man must protect his emotional boundary. Leaving does not always mean divorce. Sometimes it means creating emotional distance, spiritual independence, or physical space for healing, because no man deserves to spend his later years drowning beneath someone else's unresolved pain. Phrase number 3, I never needed you anyway. The emotional abandonment that shatters a man's spirit. Henry remembered the night his wife said this to him. It was after a small disagreement about finances, nothing serious. But suddenly, out of nowhere, she looked at him and said, "I never needed you anyway." He didn't argue back. He didn't shout. He just sat quietly staring at the floor, feeling something inside him sink, something he wasn't sure he could get back. Carl Jung taught that one of the deepest human needs is psychic belonging. The feeling that someone wants us, values our presence, and recognizes our importance in their life. When a spouse says, "I never needed you," she is not expressing independence. She is delivering emotional abandonment. This phrase cuts deeper in old age because senior men often face shrinking social circles, fewer family interactions, and reduced physical abilities. Their partner becomes their closest companion, the person who shares memories, routines, and the last chapters of life. So when that person says, "I never needed you," it is like erasing decades of love, sacrifice, and partnership. Jung explained that this kind of statement often comes from a woman trying to reclaim a sense of power or control. It isn't always literal, it's psychological defense. But to the man receiving it, it feels like betrayal. Henry told his doctor, "It felt like she deleted me from our history." Jung said that statements like this tear at the core of a senior man's self-worth. It sends him the message that his devotion didn't matter, that his loyalty was irrelevant. Older men who often define themselves by the roles they played, provider, protector, partner, feel spiritually crushed when those roles are dismissed. If a wife says this once in anger and apologizes genuinely, the wound can heal. But if she repeats it or uses it to punish, silence, or distance her husband emotionally, Jung warned it is a sign of spiritual disconnection, a psychological severing that rarely repairs itself. And the danger is real. A man who feels emotionally abandoned is more likely to experience depression, physical decline, and disconnection from life itself. Emotional abandonment accelerates aging more than most people realize. Every man deserves to feel needed, not in a dependent way, but in a human emotional soul deep way. When that need is ripped away, Jung believed the relationship crosses into a form of emotional cruelty no senior should tolerate. Phrase number 4, "I regret ever marrying you." The shadow attack that signals a breaking point. This is the phrase that finally broke Henry's heart. Not because it was shouted, not because it was said in anger, but because it was spoken softly, like a truth she had been waiting to release. When she said, "I regret ever marrying you," the room seemed to freeze. Henry felt like the air was punched out of his lungs. Carl Jung taught that when someone expresses deep regret toward a partner, not in a moment of temporary anger, but as a long-held belief, they are no longer interacting with the person in front of them. They are interacting with their shadow, the unconscious collection of resentments, disappointments, and unprocessed emotions they never learned to face. This statement has devastating psychological power because it questions the entire meaning of a man's life. A marriage is not just a legal bond, it is a story, a shared identity, a journey of years and memories. When someone says they regret the marriage, they are denying the validity of that entire journey. For seniors, this is especially damaging. At 70, 80, or beyond, you cannot rewrite your life. You cannot start over in the same way younger people can. So when your partner declares regret, it can feel like they are throwing away your shared past, a past you can no longer change. Henry described it as losing the meaning of half my life in one sentence. Jung warned that this phrase is a projection of deep dissatisfaction within the speaker, not the fault of the partner. But understanding that does not lessen the pain. This type of regretful statement creates emotional insecurity. A man might begin questioning whether his love was real, whether his best years were wasted, whether his existence was a burden. These thoughts are dangerous, especially in older men who already face loneliness and declining self-worth. And here is the Jungian truth. When someone weaponizes regret, they are no longer communicating, they are attacking. If this phrase becomes a pattern or is said without remorse, Jung advised that the receiver must protect his soul, because no elderly man deserves to spend his final years feeling like he was a mistake. Phrase number 5, "I don't care what happens to you." The final break in emotional bonding. The last phrase Jung warned about is not just painful, it is spiritually catastrophic. Henry heard this sentence during a moment of vulnerability. He had just come back from a doctor's appointment where he learned his blood pressure was dangerously high. He told his wife he was scared that he needed to reduce stress, that he didn't want to end up in the hospital again. She looked at him, shrugged, and said the words he will never forget. "I don't care what happens to you." There was no anger in her voice, no urgency, just indifference, the coldest emotion of all. Carl Jung believed that the opposite of love is not hatred, it is indifference. Hatred still acknowledges a bond, however strained, but indifference is the absence of all emotional connection. This phrase reveals a psychological state where the spouse has withdrawn emotionally, symbolically, and spiritually from the relationship. When a wife no longer cares about her husband's well-being, his health, his fear, his safety, his life, she has stepped out of the role of partner and entered the role of bystander. Jung taught that indifference is the death of intimacy. It is the death of mutual empathy. It is the death of shared humanity. For an elderly man, this level of emotional withdrawal is not just heartbreaking, it is dangerous. Stress hormones rise, loneliness intensifies, anxiety takes root, blood pressure spikes, sleep worsens. The risk of heart attack and stroke increases dramatically. Studies show that seniors who feel emotionally uncared for by their spouse have a significantly higher rate of cardiovascular events compared to those who feel supported. The heart literally weakens when it feels unwanted. When Henry heard those words, he felt something inside him break quietly. He said later, "It wasn't anger, it was like my soul dimmed." Jung warned that when a partner expresses complete emotional indifference, the connection has dissolved. What remains is not a marriage, but an arrangement. And no elderly person deserves to live out their final years in emotional isolation while sharing a home with someone who no longer cares. Leaving does not always mean divorce. Sometimes it means creating distance, seeking support from friends and family, re-establishing emotional independence, or refusing to let another person's indifference define your worth. This phrase is the clearest sign that the relationship is no longer a source of life, peace, or psychological safety. And according to Jung, psychological safety is the foundation of a meaningful final chapter in life. No man should face his senior years feeling alone beside someone who vowed to love him. Final thoughts. Let's take a moment to breathe gently and reflect on the emotional journey we've traveled today. Henry's story is not rare. Many elderly men suffer silently, believing that hurtful words are simply marriage problems they must endure. But Carl Jung taught us to look beneath the surface to understand the symbolic meaning behind the things a spouse says. We learned that the phrase "you're useless to me now" is the voice of contempt, the deadliest poison in a relationship, erasing a man's sense of worth. We saw how everything wrong in my life is your fault is projection, the dumping of unhealed wounds onto a partner's shoulders. We understood that I never needed you anyway, is emotional abandonment, the denial of belonging that destroys a senior man's spirit. We explored how I regret ever marrying you is a shadow attack, a rewriting of history that invalidates a man's entire emotional investment. And finally, we uncovered that "I don't care what happens to you" is the ultimate breaking point, the moment when love is replaced by indifference. These phrases are not ordinary fights. They are patterns of emotional harm. They leave wounds that cannot fully heal at 70, 80, or 90. And Jung believed that in later life, a man has the right to choose peace over suffering, dignity over humiliation, and emotional safety over a toxic home environment. The purpose of this video is not to encourage divorce. It is to encourage awareness and to remind seniors that their emotional well-being matters. You deserve kindness. You deserve respect. You deserve to spend your final years with people who care, whether you wake up tomorrow. If today's message spoke to your heart, please take a moment to comment, like, and subscribe to Senior Ways. Your engagement helps us reach more seniors who may be living with silent emotional pain. Share with us in the comments. Have you ever heard one of these phrases in your relationship? Did it change the way you felt about yourself? Your story may help another senior recognize their own worth. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Remember, your value does not depend on someone else's words. You are worthy of love, respect, and peace at every age. I'll see you in the next video. Take care of your heart, your spirit, and your dignity.